Josh. Hello and welcome to all of you tuning in today for today's event for the Cambridge Festival 2021. I should start off by introducing myself. My name is John Cromero and I'm commissioning editor at Cambridge University Press, where I commission books in social psychology and developmental psychology. Within these broad domains, I've been particularly interested in the psychology of gender, in parenting and family studies, and in applying psychological research to social issues. And of course, all of these factors coalesce when we think about the unequal division of labor at home between men and women and what we can precisely do about it. So I think it was in the fall of 2017 when Fran Deutsch got in touch with me with her proposal for a new book on this topic. I practically jumped at the chance to work with her on it. And the resulting book, Creating Equality at Home, How 25 Couples Around the World Share Housework and Childcare, edited by Francine M. Deutsch and Ruth Grant, was published in June 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And so on behalf of the press, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. Francine Deutsch is Professor Emerita of Psychology and Education at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. A social psychologist, Professor Deutsch's research focuses on issues of gender justice. She has studied topics as diverse as gender equality in the contemporary American family, the status of childcare workers, male responses to female competence, double standards of aging, female friendships, and the dynamics of the only child family in contemporary China. Professor Deutsch is particularly interested in resistance to gender norms and how, by undoing gender, couples can create equally sharing families. And so Creating Equality at Home, the book upon which this talk is based, presents the stories of 25 couples from 22 countries around the world whose everyday decisions about sharing housework and childcare show us that equality at home is possible and that it exists right now. So without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Fran Deutsch for today's talk on creating equality at home. Over to you, Fran.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, just one sec to get set up here. Oh. Whoops. Okay. 1979, the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which has since been ratified by almost all of the countries of the world, although sadly not in the US. Since then, there's been an increasing worldwide consensus that women should have the same social and political rights as men. And that has influenced women's lives immensely. For example, now if you look around the world, there are more women than men studying in universities. In terms of political representation, we don't yet have parity, but worldwide we went from 2% in 1945 to 24% of national representatives in parliaments as of 2019. And in many countries are doing much better than that. Rwanda is #1 with 61% of their parliament members are women. Britain didn't change much from 1945 through 1983 when it hovered below 4%. But as of June 2020, it is now 34%. In terms of employment, from 1980 to 2016, women's employment rates increased in a majority of countries. Now, although women's lives have changed dramatically in the public realm, numerous studies document the persistence of gender inequality at home. All around the globe, women come home from a day in paid work and do most of the domestic labor at home. So this is just a list of all the countries that have been studied and shown that women do more domestic labor. Nonetheless, even in the most unlikely context, people can and do choose equality. And here's a picture of our book. And as Janka said, this is we did a study of 25 couples in 22 different countries. And here's a list of the countries that were involved in our study. And you can see they're as diverse as Bhutan and Brazil, Iceland and Indonesia. But despite all this cultural diversity, this is a story of similarity, because no matter how relatively egalitarian a few of these countries are, equal sharing at home is not the norm. All of these couples are gender resistors. They refuse to enact the norms surrounding them, and in doing so, they're really creating revolutionary families. Now, why does this matter? The gender division of domestic labor is a linchpin in the system of gender inequality. When women focus on caregiving and men focus on breadwinning, it gives men more power both in and outside the family. But besides the issue of power, by splitting achievement and care, both men and women are robbed of some of their human capabilities. Now, before I talk about our study, I'm going to briefly mention previous literature on the division of household labor. These four approaches here account for hundreds of studies. Relative resources argues that the more resources, and that usually means money, one partner brings into the family compared to what the other partner brings in, the less domestic labor that person will do. The time availability approach asserts that the more time one spends in the labor force, the less domestic labor one will do, and the more one's spouse will do. Gender ideology argues that couples who believe in non-traditional gender ideology will have more equal division of labor than those who believe in more traditional norms. And finally, the national context approach argues that countries that are more egalitarian, gender egalitarian in general, couples in those countries will have a more equal division of labor, as well as countries that have family-friendly policies. Now, all of these approaches have found some support for relative differences in the gender gap across couples. But the key word here is relative. Even when women earn as much as their husbands, work as many hours in the labor force, and live in the world's most egalitarian countries, on average, women still do more domestic labor than men. So why is this inequality so persistent? The doing gender approach argues that when women do domestic labor and when men refrain from doing it, they are producing more than a clean house and well cared for children. They are producing gender. In an interesting study in Poland, men were given false feedback that they had low testosterone levels, and subsequently they did less housework, presumably to reassert their masculinity. Now, West and Zimmerman, who created this approach, argued that gender is constantly being created in our everyday social interactions when we are aware during all those interactions that we're being judged according to gendered norms. And gender becomes even more central after the birth of a child. The transition to parenting has a traditionalizing effect on couples, even among those who were more equal before. Gendered expectations push women to feel more responsible for taking care of babies, and push men to feel more responsible for breadwinning. Then at that moment, couples are making decisions about how to balance work and family life. And those decisions then shape the division of labor going forward. And doing gender often entails what's been called a rhetoric of choice, where women say they've been choosing this somewhat more traditional path, ignoring all the gender pressures that push them that way. Now, the doing gender approach was very important for arguing for the centrality of gender and for putting the emphasis on everyday social interactions. But there's one big problem with it. It has nothing to say about how gendered expectations can be resisted. So ultimately, it leaves us hopeless by implying that there's no way to avoid doing gender. But we argue that if gender can be done, it can be undone. We focus on the everyday acts of resistance of couples. We show that they become equal sharers by undoing gender, by dismantling the differences between them that create gender. So here's what we did. First, I recruited scholars from around the world to collaborate. I sought out feminist social scientists who worked on work-family issues and had published in English. Each agreed to follow our protocol. They then recruited and screened couples to find equal sharers. The couples had to be heterosexual, married or cohabiting, both in the labor force, have children under 14, and not be professors. Now, why heterosexual? Because gay people are not the problem. Gay couples are far more egalitarian than their heterosexual counterparts. The screening asked them about a whole range of domestic tasks, and it also asked them their overall sense of the division of labor between them. They had to both agree that it was equal, and they had to convince us that they were equal by the way that they were dividing tasks. Then they were interviewed face-to-face by one of our partners using a standard interview. And finally, we analyzed the interviews. First, we did them one by one to just look at each case and try to get a sense of what were the factors that were helping them share. And then we did a cross-case analysis to look at the themes that emerged across all of these cases. Now, gender is typically reproduced, as I indicated, when men prioritize paid work and women prioritize care in their everyday decisions and actions. So the equally sharing couples undid gender in these 5 key ways. And I'll just give you a second to look at that. And then I'm going to talk about these one at a time. So first, we have men and paid work. Driven by norms of hegemonic masculinity, men typically put paid work at the center of their identities. They make decisions that maximize breadwinning and career success. And they do that by seeking promotions, by working long hours, and by letting their jobs impinge on their family life. The equally sharing fathers, in contrast, prioritize care over paid work. Take Ivo in Croatia, who took 3 years off to care for his baby daughter, Emma. This is what he said: compared to Emma, my job is in 10th, 15th, 20th place. The men in the equally sharing families do the kinds of things that mothers have typically done. So here's some of what they did. They took parental leave. So in 8 of the 22 countries, fathers took some sort of parental leave, sometimes supported by government policy, like in Sweden, and sometimes not, like in Australia, where Mike dropped out of the labor force for a period after his daughter was born. They worked part-time. In 5 of the families, both parents worked part-time. For example, Hannes in Germany took advantage of a government policy to drop down to a 16-hour work week, and he's one of only 5% of German fathers who do that. They negotiated with employers. Mike in Australia was an operating theater technician, and he had a great reputation as a worker, and he was able to leverage that to negotiate for a 30-hour-a-week schedule. They made family-friendly career choices. Nick in the United States quit a much more lucrative job as a production manager to become a firefighter because he knew that would give him time at home with his children. Likewise, they gave up promotions. João in Brazil was a pilot, and he gave up the chance to become a captain, even though it meant more money and more prestige, but he knew it would take too much time away from the family. They also insisted on their parental rights. Osman's boss in Singapore gives him a hard time when he takes time off to care for a sick child. He reports, quote, "He makes it tough. I got called in by my boss. He said, 'Yesterday, you took childcare leave.' I said, 'Yes.' The boss asked, 'Well, why didn't your wife take it?' But if I insist, there's absolutely nothing he can do." And Osman adds that if he doesn't get promoted because of that, well, so be it. And we heard that from a number of the men, that they were willing to suffer some kind of career penalty in order to be fully involved with taking care of their children. Denisa in the Czech Republic reported that when her husband, David, announced that he was taking parental leave, which he was entitled to by law, quote, "They gazed at him like he had gone mad, and they threatened him with losing his job, but he took the leave anyway. Now, at a superficial level, these men have more time available, so their involvement is consistent with the time availability hypothesis that I mentioned before. But what's critical are the choices they are making to choose work compatible with time for family and to take advantage of the flexibility of their jobs and their rights. Men and care. Men also undo gender by engaging in the kind of care that mothers have traditionally done, both in terms of time and tasks. They spend far more time than other fathers with their children, and they take on the routine, hands-on tasks that are usually left to mothers. They also embrace the nurturing aspects of parenting. So by hands-on care, I'm talking about things like diapering, feeding, bathing. Now, babies obviously need the most of this kind of care, and at least 19 of these 25 fathers were intensely involved in infant care. Veronica in the USA speaks for many of the mothers when she says, quote, "From day one, he has been doing everything that I do, with the exception of breastfeeding." But even breastfeeding was not an impediment when couples wanted to share. Gadi in Israel was on night duty with his colicky daughter when his wife was on leave. He woke up when she needed comforting, and when she needed to be fed, he would change her and bring her to Netta to be nursed. Older children, of course, still need care. These fathers share in the routines of waking up their children in the morning, making their breakfast, making sure they brush their teeth, helping with homework, and reading bedtime stories. And they don't shy away even from the unpleasant tasks of parenting. The most notable was Richard in Austria, who specialized in dealing with vomiting children. Now, mothers cuddle and bestow affection. They soothe crying babies, they comfort children when they're distressed, and they take care of them when they're sick. These are the stereotypes of what we mean by maternal care. The equally sharing fathers do all of these things, from waking up at night with infants to responding to children's emotional needs. And sick care was also shared in the majority of families. And in the majority of families, parents reported that their children were equally attached to their mothers and their fathers, no matter how young they were. And that's testimony to the kind of care that fathers give. And finally, some of these men undid gender by developing expertise about parenting. It's usually only mothers who read the parenting books, but at least in 4 of the countries, men read up on parenting even before the baby was born. Now, some scholars argue that men like these, who reject hegemonic masculinity and do care work, are creating what they call a caring masculinity. We disagree. We believe that undoing gender is a better formulation. Why call it masculinity just because men are doing it? Caring and care work are human capabilities available to both men and women. So women in care. Women undo gender when they relinquish exclusive primary care for their children and make room for their husbands to share. It's unlikely, for example, that a man would take parental leave without his wife's endorsement. Nira in Croatia says of Ivo's leave, "I gave him the opportunity to be a dad as I am a mom. I didn't take these rights away from him." Gatekeeping refers to women's attempts to retain authority and control over childcare by discouraging fathers' efforts to be involved. The equally sharing mothers are not gatekeepers. Netta in Israel, I often joke that she's the opposite of a gatekeeper. She refused to read the parenting books. Instead, she told Gadi, her husband, "You read them and just summarize them for me." They also undo gender when they stop trying to live up to idealized notions of motherhood. The equally sharing mothers admit that motherhood is not always an idyllic experience and that it can be hard to be home with a baby. Maja in Montenegro confessed that when her first child didn't sleep at night, she was furious, she said, like a man would be. Overwhelmingly, women take their careers as seriously as their husbands do. In fact, in 8 of the families, the woman's career was considered the more important one in the family. In 13, the careers were considered equal. And in only 4 were the husband's careers given priority. And when women made more money than their husbands, as they did in 9 of the families, they undid gender by accepting their breadwinning role without resentment. Inez, in fact, in Portugal, was proud of the fact that she made more money than her husband, Pedro, and that gave her career a kind of priority. Now, Felipe, an undocumented Latinx husband in the US, he was happy to take full responsibility for sharing the care of his 2 daughters. But when he couldn't find work and he had to rely on Xochitl's income, he felt worthless. Xochitl, however, asserted that she didn't lose respect for him. I don't see it that way, she said. And finally, although in many countries it is common for couples to have 1.5 jobs, that is a husband working full-time and a wife working part-time, that pattern was never seen in this group. Either both partners worked full-time or both worked part-time. Now, the women did vary in how central career was to their identities. A couple of them had very high-level jobs, like Hildur in Iceland, who is the project manager of a creative team of 60 people. She's so involved in her work, she often forgets to eat lunch, and she describes her job as fun, but very demanding. But even women who temporarily took a more traditional route found ways to keep their careers from becoming derailed. Perhaps the most traditional in the group was Veronica in the USA, who stayed home with her kids for 8 years. But when her first child was born, she didn't give up on the track to become a certified public accountant. She quit paid work only after she had received her license, so that even after 8 years at home, she was able to find a good job. Now, sometimes when you listen to the rhetoric of the equally sharing women, it might sound traditional because a lot of them say family is more important than career. But what set these families apart is that this notion of family first is not gendered. Whatever compromises they are making in paid work were matched by their husbands. Well, obviously, housework is a very important domain of undoing gender. Childcare may have intrinsic rewards, but cleaning the bathtub, doing the laundry, and dishwashing are not fun. Although all the equal sharers would agree that housework is not women's work and shouldn't be, in 12 couples, it was equally shared. In 6, the women did more, and in 6, the men did more. And in 1, they disagreed about who was doing more. In some families, this kind of cooperation was seamless. In Indonesia, for example, Budi describes, well, she cooks, I do laundry or clean. If she does the laundry, I cook rice. But some families do struggle. But lest we think this is simply gendered, keep in mind there were as many equally sharing men dissatisfied with their wives' housekeeping as the reverse. For middle-class couples, they often resolve this by hiring outside help. However, Felipe in the US, who gets angry with Xochitl for not tidying up, they're low-income workers. They can't afford to get outside help, so he does it himself. So to summarize, the ways in which the equally sharing men and women undo gender are linked. Men's unconventional relation to paid work allows them to share care, which enables their wives to invest and succeed in careers, which in turn promotes their willingness to make room to share care and encourages men's care work. Now, I don't mean to say that this is easy. The process of becoming equal is flawed and messy. Women sometimes have to fight themselves to keep from gatekeeping. They may sometimes feel bad about not being exclusively number one with their children, and they worry about their husband's egos. Sometimes they even have to manage family work. Despite these flaws, however, these couples have created truly revolutionary families. Now, as I mentioned, there's no country in the world where equal sharing is the norm. The equal sharers defy social norms and live this unconventional motherhood and fatherhood, but they are surrounded by inequality. Hildur says, we hardly know any couple that divides equally, even though our friends are similar in education and political views. And Mickey, I rather see the more traditional family model is more dominant, where the father is the breadwinner, works a lot, and it's the mother who is responsible for raising the child. And Philippe, the women have to warm up the food for the husband. I want my plate. And the men sit down and the women get up at 5 a.m. to make their breakfast. They're nonconformists, the equal sharers. 18 of the couples reported outright criticism for their non-traditional arrangements. Nira in Croatia, like other mothers who left infants with their fathers, got the message that they are not good mothers. Her mother, her doctor, and other relatives criticized her for going back to her job. She heard sarcastic comments like, what, does he breastfeed too? And it isn't just the older generation that criticizes. Hildur in Iceland often gets asked if it's okay for her to work these long hours. She says, it's like he shouldn't feel guilty, but I should feel guilty. The equally sharing men get the message that they have been emasculated. Che Wang in Bhutan says his relatives advise him not to act this way because it will lessen his authority and people will make fun of him. And Philippe reports that people talk about him behind his back. She treats him like a mandalone, a whipped or emasculated male. And women are also criticized for their treatment of their husbands by expecting them to share. Denise's mother, Czech mother, warns her that she may lose her husband. So how do they resist in the face of all this social pressure? So these are the key factors that we found that facilitate equal sharing. And I'll describe them one by one. Personality. Based on previous research, we know that people who are self-confident, have a secure identity, and have high self-esteem are less likely to conform. And that people are more likely to live according to their values if their self-esteem is based on their intrinsic sense of self-worth rather than their achievements or what other people think of them. The equally sharing men's identities, as I mentioned, and their self-esteem are not entirely based on career achievement, and the women had sources of self-esteem beyond motherhood. Second, social norms only elicit conformity when the group that holds the norm is relevant and important, when we care about what that group thinks. So the equal sharers often just laughed off the criticism of the older generation. Some intentionally constructed a social group among their peers that would be supportive, or dropped friends who didn't share their values. Lily in China made sure she picked friends whose husbands were involved because she wanted that to seem normal to her husband. And third, some people actually have a need for distinctiveness. For example, Richard in Austria loves his counter-normative role. He says, standing out, yeah, being someone special in society, I like that. The kids are playing, you're drinking coffee, the moms and I like that. The fact that it's unusual, that I'm doing something unusual. So then there are the values. These are the key values that support equal sharing. First of all, non-traditional gender ideology. When Maja in Montenegro was asked why she and her husband share domestic labor, she proclaimed, because I am one loudmouth feminist. Likewise, Elizabeth in Sweden is an avowed feminist, and she says her husband is one as well. She says equality is not just a nice word to them. The two Latinx men explicitly opposed machismo attitudes. And two of the men in developing countries, Honduras and Bhutan, are proud of their egalitarianism as a reflection of their modern education. But believing in equality is not enough. Women need to feel entitled to it, and the equally sharing women too. For some, it was a bottom line in marriage or becoming parents. Hildur in Iceland said, I had decided I couldn't be in love with a man that expects that I should do a lot more than he and clean up after him. And Hande in Turkey said, I can never establish that kind of marriage or relationship. Always serving a man, everywhere is clean, magnificent house, food is being prepared. That can't happen. These women speak clearly and directly to their husbands about their expectations. So Inez in Portugal, she was a little bit worried about Pedro when she observed his bachelor habits when he was living with a group of friends. But when they moved in together and she saw that he had left a sock lying around, she said to him, "Where do you think you are?" And Pedro shaped up. And now she says if she goes out, she comes home and her house is totally clean and tidy, like a maid has been there. Other women made it clear that helping wasn't enough. Netta in Israel said to her husband, listen, this house is not just mine, it's ours. Look around and take responsibility whenever you see something that needs to be done. Now, again, that isn't to say that this is always easy, and sometimes women had to compromise. Patty, for example, got Nick to do more housework when he was home with the kids, but she had to let up on some of her perfectionist standards. Housework was much more likely to be a source of contention than childcare. Most of these women went into marriage expecting to share childcare. Dale in the UK reports that Catherine asked him, "Are you going to be a bit of a hands-on dad?" He corrected himself. Actually, it might have been just a statement. You're going to be a bit of a hands-on dad. And Elizabeth in Sweden wasn't even sure that she wanted to have children, having watched her friends fall into traditional roles after they had children. But she was reassured in discussions with Mikhail when he made it clear he wanted to be as big a part of his children's lives as Elizabeth did. Now, Seeger and Osmond in Singapore are an ironic counterexample of all the couples touting non-traditional gender ideology. They asserted a belief in traditional roles. He said that it's his responsibility to support the family financially. She says that it's her responsibility to cook her husband's dinner. Yet, in reality, they are co-breadwinners and they go out to eat every night. In some Western countries, there's a myth of equality. Couples who ostensibly believe in gender equality but live traditional lives. Seeger and Osmond had a myth of traditionalism. A traditional life simply didn't meet their other goals. Moreover, Seeger's sense of entitlement, her insistence that she doesn't want to be a maid like her mother, belies the traditionalism. Seeger is a feminist, even if she protests otherwise. Now, inequality is bolstered by essentialism, which is an ideology that touts women's superior nurturing abilities. The equal sharers reject the belief that men and women are fundamentally different. Here's some of what they say when asked if women had a greater ability to care for children. Netta, why should they be less able to care for little babies? No way. Sojatil, no, I believe that has nothing to do with it. This is simply machista mentality. And Nero, men cannot give birth or breastfeed. These are things that are not important in child upbringing. A man can develop equally good connections with their child, just like a mom or a grandmother. And I vote this is nonsense. Patty, well, they can't nurse, but other than that, no, absolutely not. Now, a couple of the men initially thought that mothers had some kind of special ability, but their experience with their own children convinced them otherwise. Like Tomas in Slovenia said, we both had to learn everything. At times we panicked, got hysterical because we didn't know a thing and had to ask our doctor about every little problem. And Dale in the UK said, before having kids, you think maybe the mums would naturally be better at comforting, but I don't think that's true. Now, anti-essentialist views are both a cause and a consequence of equal sharing. In unequal families, essentialist beliefs discourage paternal involvement, which in turn reduces fathers' opportunities to become skilled and able to soothe babies, convincing them erroneously that women have an innate skill. Now, in contrast to that vicious circle, When couples believed that fathers were equally suited to parenting, they facilitated paternal involvement, and their involvement created a virtuous circle in which they became as skilled as their wives, thus reinforcing their anti-essentialist views. Familism. Family, or at least the nuclear family, is central to the lives of equal sharers. Martin in the Czech Republic says, "There's nothing more important in my life than family. I have other interests, lots of them, but for me, this comes first." And familism was also reflected in the sense of we-ness that many of the couples expressed. Chewang in Bhutan describes that as a change that he felt with his wife Yang Chen, going from two separate people to a we after they became parents. And finally, anti-materialism. When parents are employed part-time, when they give up promotions or lower their aspirations for advancement, their decisions entail a financial penalty. About half of the couples voluntarily reduce their income, suggesting an anti-materialist ethic. Judith in Switzerland and her husband both worked part-time. She sounded proud when she reported that they owned half a car, don't own a TV, don't wear designer clothes, and grow their own produce. Now, interestingly, CD and Osman are the outliers again. In contrast to this anti-materialism, the desire for a materially comfortable lifestyle is part of what propels their equality. They want, in Singapore, what's called the 5 C's: cash, credit cards, condo, car, and country club. And the best way for them to get all that is to work together. Now, we ask, what role do the families these couples grew up in play? Social cognitive developmental theories of socialization tell a simple story: that we learn gender roles by watching our parent of the same sex, by learning from what they're doing, and from the praise that we get for acting according to our gender. So the implication here is that non-traditional parents would have non-traditional children, and traditional parents would have traditional children. The story that we found was much more complex. Let's start with the men. Consistent with the theory, 10 of the men did have exposure to fathers who weren't stereotypically male. Now, David in the Czech Republic was the only one who had an equally sharing father. But fathers in Singapore, Iceland, Israel, Honduras, and Brazil all talked about their fathers cooking and cleaning. And some of the other men described ways that their fathers defied a kind of standard masculinity. Dale in the UK said of his father, he was quite arty, and he was never sort of a blokey bloke. But almost as many men talked about fathers who were either absent or anti-models. Luke in Montenegro said with bitterness about his father, house duties, nothing, total disaster. It's not only that he didn't participate in house chores, he barely participated in our life as a father. Richard says of his father's parenting, I couldn't learn anything from him except how not to do it. And although the socialization literature puts a big emphasis on same-sex models, mothers and sisters were often key to some of the lessons that men learned growing up. In half of the families, men reported having significant childcare and or housework experience growing up, and it was the mothers or sisters who expected it. Robinson's Honduran mother taught him to cook, iron, and do laundry explicitly so he could help his wife. And Sam credits his 3 sisters for him getting used to housework. If they had to do it, I had to do it. Now, strikingly, as boys, many of these men were expected to participate in housework and care work, even though their parents may have had a very traditionally gendered relationship. For example, Budi in Indonesia, his father's job was simply to earn money, not to do anything within the house. Yet Budi helped his mother by ironing his father's clothes, washing his own clothes, going to the market with her, and helping her take care of babies as young as 1 month old. And although the men credit this experience for the skill they have in domestic work. Perhaps even more important than that is that they learned that these tasks didn't need to be gendered. Philippe's mother taught him to change diapers. So he says now, unlike his peers, changing diapers does not make him feel like a woman. Men also referred to their mothers as role models. When Richard was asked where did he learn the most about parenting, he said his mother, who filled her children with love. So how about the women? These women typically grew up in families where their mothers worked for pay but did most of the work at home. However, 6 of them did have families that defied these norms. Inez said about her family of origin, okay, her father wasn't an equal sharer like Pedro, but he was a super father and he did anything that her mother asked in terms of domestic work. Now, Netta in Israel got a really interesting lesson from her mother. Her mother had done most of that housework and childcare, but after 20 years of sole responsibility for cooking, washing, and cleaning, Netta reports, one day my mother said, enough is enough. Out of the blue, she said, I'm fed up, that's it. And from then on, my father underwent a total changeover. He does the dishes, tidies the house, folds the laundry, all those things he had never done for years, he suddenly started doing. But for many other women, their mothers' lives were cautionary tales. Sidi in Singapore repeatedly said that she did not want to be a maid. She wanted a marriage to be a companionship. And Petra in Slovenia adamantly rejected her parents' lifestyle. She said, I can't live like this, like our mothers did. Even then, I thought to myself, why are they not equal? So we can see that socialization is not that simple. There are multiple paths to equal sharing. And finally, government policy. It's no surprise that supportive government policies can promote equality. Fathers in 8 of the countries, Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, Iceland, Portugal, Slovenia, Sweden, and the UK, used policies that help them share childcare. Policies that promote time with children, like targeted leaves for fathers, earmarked leaves, allow fathers to form close bonds with their children that are then self-perpetuating. But there are 2 caveats. First, men have to make the decision to use parental leave when it's available. Even in Sweden, where there's a very high uptake of the leaves that are specifically targeted for fathers. When you look at the leave, the part of the leave that is shared between mothers can be shared between mothers and fathers. In only about 18% of the cases is that part of the leave shared equally. Second, a number of the men found ways to take time off to care for children without using government benefits. Nick, in the notorious United States, which is one of the only countries in the world without a paid maternity leave, let alone a parental leave, he saved up his vacation time and he was able to take the summer off after his daughter was born to help take care of her. So structure in the form of government policies, of course it matters, but don't forget agency, what people decide to do. Okay, the rewards. Well, it's easy to see how equal sharing benefits women. Relief from the double day. High-powered careers like Hilda's in Iceland might not be possible without a husband who shares. But any career is more easily managed with a partner who shares. Take Catherine in the UK. When their first child was born, she went down to a 3-day week. But she observed that she was no longer being taken seriously at her job. So she talked to Dale about it, and he agreed to go down to a 4-day week so she could go up to a 4-day week. And that really helped her career. Women who shared leaves could return to their jobs with the peace of mind of having a father as a caregiver. And equally sharing
Women also could actually enjoy some leisure time. Nira in Croatia points out that if she goes out for the evening with her friends, Ivo can handle any problem. He doesn't just call her because the baby's crying. Now, men, I think, are the big winners because they know how easy it would have been for them to miss the kinds of relationships with their children that they have. The men who took parental leave were all enthusiastic about it, and equal sharing boosted men's self-esteem. As I mentioned, Richard in Austria was so proud that he was living this unusual life. And Che Wang, who puts up with a lot of criticism from his peers, is proud when he hears his wife praising the role he has in her family. Nick was terrified when he knew he was going to take care of his infant son on his own. What am I going to do with this baby, he thought. But he tried different things, including Einstein tapes. And now you can hear how proud he sounds when he says about his son. Maybe that's why he's such a good reader now. By undoing gender, men develop the capacity to care and change the way they see themselves. Joao asserts that developing himself to be a better father has made him grow as a human being, that the exercise of giving to a child generalizes to friends, to family, to people who aren't even relatives. But I think the biggest payoff is the joy and wonder that can come from parenting. Listen to these men. I'm Richard. I'm crazy about my kids and I love the time I spend with them. It's a perfect fit. I wouldn't have it any other way. Nikki, I look at my child and I'm filled with happiness. Beautiful, clever, and my child. I cannot believe it. Martin, I'm in a relationship with growing up humans. I watch them, how they feel joy, get angry, how they get stubborn, how they get attention, become loving. That is the benefit. Hannes, it's simply a joy to play with a child and see her grow up. And when the little girl laughs for the first time, these are true experiences of success. It's practically irreplaceable. And David, when you look at him, it is pure joy. Research tells us that involved fatherhood is good for children, and the equal sharers agree. Parents mention that shared care means they can take over for each other. Dale in the UK explains that Catherine takes over if he gets too shouty, and he does the same for her. Some parents mention that they like giving their children non-traditional models. The two Latinx men, Felipe in the USA and Robinson in Honduras, are trying to convey to their daughters that they don't have to marry machistas. Elizabeth in Sweden and Christine in Austria like that their children are witnessing happy working mothers. And equal sharing can promote good marriages. In fact, the more egalitarian a couple's division of housework and childcare, there's increasing evidence that their marriages are benefiting. And it goes both ways. Happy marriages promote egalitarianism. Several women mentioned that sharing means they can better understand each other's experience. Catherine reflects, it's easy not to appreciate how hard it is staying home with children. With Dale having done it, he appreciates exactly what it involves, so there's no taking it for granted. And overwhelmingly, these couples are happy with their lives together. Joao says it the most romantically. I believe that Cecilia is my soulmate and she feels that I'm her soulmate. So there is this feeling of complementarity, empathy, strong friendship. We know that neither of us is walking alone, that we really are a team and that our son is part of this team along with us. So the good news is equality is possible when men and women in diverse cultures reject the norms that dictate masculinity and femininity. They can undo gender and create equally sharing families. Theories that focus on structure miss the importance of human agency. Of course, structure matters. It's certainly easier for middle-class couples like Christine and Richard in Austria to forego potential income and set up their work lives to support equality than it is for Philippe and Sojatil in the US who barely earn minimum wage. Yet, Philippe and Sojatil do share. It is not an accident that on average, Swedish couples have a more equal division of household labor than Brazilian couples do. Nonetheless, Brazilian couples like Joao and Cecilia can equally share. In Undoing Gender, they challenge the gendered beliefs of people around them as well. It's difficult to argue that men are not capable of nurturing children when one observes a father like Joao. This is Pete Seeger. He was an American folk singer who worked for social justice his whole life in the labor, civil rights, anti-war, and environmental movements. His words inspire us. The key to the future of the world is finding optimistic stories and letting them be known. In creating equality at home, we have tried to do just that. And with thanks to all of my partners, and the special and most important thanks to my brilliant co-author, Ruth Grant.
Hello, thank you, Fran, for such a fascinating and ultimately inspiring talk. It was wonderful to hear about these equally sharing couples. It looks like we have just about 10 minutes or a little bit less, so I'd love to open it up to our audience to see if there are any questions. Oh yes, I see there's a question that's popped up in the chat that was received by email. So Fran, how has COVID and the effects of lockdown over the past year impacted equality? And do you see these effects lasting long term?
Yeah, so it's a very complicated picture. So I would not say on average it has made couples more equal. I think it has created some opportunities to create equality. So, and I have actually interviewed several couples whose division of labor became more equal during COVID. And so it depends a lot on what the structural situation is in this case, in that if the father was able to work at home, for example, and the mother was not, then the father was really got much more involved in childcare. If both were working at home, one of the things that happened in that situation is that the work became much more visible. So not only was there more work because somebody had to be supervising the children's education, but the fathers could see the kinds of things that mothers were doing that they might not have noticed before. So in some families, it really did propel them towards a more equal sharing. And I guess it's hard to know what will happen in the future, but I think particularly with respect to childcare, I think the more that men are involved in childcare, my research tells me the more they're involved, the more they want to be involved. Because what happens when they're involved is their relationships with their children change. And those relationships, become more intimate, more, the children rely on them more. They don't always run to the mothers when they're hurt. And that has a big emotional impact on men. Now, of course, we always have the problem of jobs. And when people go back to their jobs, it again depends on how the role that the job is going to play in their life, and the role that career is going to play in their life.
Right. Actually, related to that, I myself was wondering whether you'd been in touch with any of the couples from the study during the pandemic to see whether their commitment to equal sharing lasted during such an unprecedented crisis, and the efforts of juggling working from home.
Right. I would bet with these couples, I have no doubt. I mean, I didn't contact them, but I have no doubt that, having done it under circumstances that actually make it hard to share, I have no doubt about them. What's more a question is those who became more equal as a result of the pandemic, and what's going to happen when their work situation changes again. We don't know.
I've just received a question in the Q&A box. Laura says, I was a bit surprised that these are all heterosexual examples. Is there a plan to explore how same-sex couples distribute caring and household responsibilities as well?
Okay, well, as I said, maybe you missed it. What I said in the beginning is gay couples are just way more egalitarian than heterosexual couples. There's no comparison. And but there are people, it's not in the work that I've done. The reason I know that is because there is a whole area of literature looking at gay couples. Most of the literature is about lesbian couples, because it's been more recent that male couples have started to adopt children and have surrogates or whatever. But the overwhelming finding is that these couples are much more equal. And what's interesting about it is I know about one study where they looked at lesbian couples that had adopted and heterosexual couples who had adopted. So they're in the same situation in a sense biologically. However, the lesbian couples were way more egalitarian than the heterosexual couples.
Oh, Laura followed up by saying, I did miss the beginning, sorry, and thanks for asking and answering.
Yeah.
We should have time for another question if there are any. Give people a moment, perhaps. Well, I did have another question myself, actually, Fran. In the book, you had a section dedicated to how gender persists despite the attempts to undo it. And one of them is the managing piece, i.e. the mental work of parenting. And you refer to it as the final frontier of couples trying to achieve equality at home. And it's also often referred to as the mental load of motherhood.
Right.
So even when couples are successful at equal sharing the day-to-day practical or physical tasks, generally the mental to-do list still falls onto the women. And what can we do about that? Is it a piece of the maternal gatekeeping that you'd mentioned?
Yeah, I don't know. To some extent, I think it may be partly a subtle way that women retain a kind of control. But I also think, men resist. It is work. It's work to have it on your mind that
it's effortful, certainly.
Yeah, it's effortful, and it's it takes away from your ability to concentrate at work and things like that. I think one approach to kind of dealing with that is to delegate a thing for responsibility. So if I'm going to take care of the doctor's appointments, you take care of the dentist appointments, and I'm not going to pay attention to that. So. But it also means women giving up paying attention to things that might be important. And some of the equally sharing men complained that a couple of them complained that she's asking me, did I do this when I do take care of that? Mm-hmm. So it goes both ways.
Of course, yes.
It goes both ways, but it is an important realm to pay attention to. I agree.
We've received two questions. They're actually very related. Monica and Joshua. Monica asks, are all couples highly educated? While Joshua asks, did a high level of education play a role in creating equality?
Absolutely not. And, I'll just go at one end of the continuum. Philippe and Sojatil, they are, they're undocumented, low wage workers who don't have any kind of higher education. I specifically ruled out professors because I know everybody discounts what professors do. So I don't think it was high education. And also there's a lot of studies that show ways in which working class couples who might not tout, at least in the United States, who might not tout gender equality, in fact, share more equally than a lot of upper middle class couples. So I do not think education per se, it really depends on what's going on, how people manage their work lives. I think it's really the key thing, especially how men are managing their work lives. So a lot of very highly educated men are very career oriented, which is, if you put career as number one, it makes it very hard to share equally.
I think those are all the questions, and we've just come up to the end of the session. So I guess that's all the time we have for today. I'd just like to end this talk by thanking Professor Deutsch for taking part in this year's Cambridge Festival and for such a fascinating talk. And thank you as well for our audience for joining us and for the insightful questions. So just to say, the book Creating Equality at Home is now out with Cambridge University Press, and it's available for purchase on our website and through all major retailers. So definitely buy the book, read the real life stories of couples who share equally, from Bhutan to Brazil, from China to Croatia, the UK and the US. You'll find them both relatable and inspiring. I know I certainly did.